When I first let him stay in my guest room, it felt like the right thing to do. He said it would only be for a few weeks, just until he got back on his feet. He had lost his job, his previous roommate had moved out suddenly, and he looked genuinely defeated when he asked. I had known him for over a year, and while our relationship had its ups and downs, I never imagined he would become someone I'd fear. The guest room was small but comfortable, and I made it clear from the beginning that this was temporary. He agreed, smiling, promising he'd start applying for jobs the very next day. The first month was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. He slept late, stayed up even later, and spent hours scrolling on his phone or playing games. When I asked about job applications, he always had an excuse. The listings weren't right. The pay was too low. He was waiting to hear back from somewhere. I tried to be patient, reminding myself that everyone struggles sometimes. I paid the rent, utilities, groceries, everything, telling myself it was only temporary. By the second month, things started to shift. He began acting like the apartment belonged to him. He rearranged furniture without asking. He criticized how I cooked, how I dressed, how I spent my free time. If I went out with friends, he wanted to know where I was, who I was with, and when I'd be back. When I mentioned boundaries, he laughed it off and said couples didn't need them. I reminded him he wasn't on the lease. He shrugged and said that didn't really matter. By the third month, the tension was constant. The guest room door was always open now, his things spreading into the living room, the bathroom, even my bedroom. One night, during an argument about bills, he said it casually, like it was nothing. Either add me to the lease, or I'll tell police you're controlling me. I stared at him, unsure if I'd heard him right. He repeated it, slower this time, watching my reaction. He said living here without his name on the lease made him vulnerable, and if I didn't fix that, he'd make sure someone else did. I told him no. Calmly, firmly. I said he had never paid rent, never contributed, and had overstayed his welcome. His face changed instantly. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just picked up his phone and walked into the kitchen. A few seconds later, I heard him speaking clearly, confidently, telling the operator that he was being controlled, that he felt unsafe, that I wouldn't let him leave. My hand started shaking as I realized what he was doing. The minutes before the police arrived felt unreal, like time was stretched thin and heavy. He sat on the couch, phone in hand, calm and almost smug. I stood in my bedroom doorway, heart racing, trying to understand how the situation had flipped so quickly. Just moments ago, he was threatening me. Now, he was the one calling for help. I replayed our conversations in my head, wondering if I'd missed something, if I'd been naive from the start. When the sirens grew louder, he stood up and adjusted his shirt, practicing the worried expression he planned to wear. I could see it clearly now. This wasn't panic, it was strategy. He wanted to scare me into giving him what he wanted. The knock at the door made my stomach drop. He opened it before I could even move, greeting the officers like they were expected guests. He told his story smoothly. He said I monitored his movements, controlled his finances, and threatened to throw him out with nowhere to go. He said I refused to let him leave unless he agreed to certain conditions. As he spoke, he glanced at me occasionally, like he was checking to see if I was intimidated enough to stay silent. One officer nodded, taking notes. The other looked around the apartment, quiet but observant. When they asked me to explain, my voice trembled at first, but I forced myself to slow down. I told them the truth, that he had moved into my guest room temporarily, that he wasn't on the lease, that he hadn't paid rent, that he had just threatened to call police if I didn't add him to the lease. I showed them text messages where he talked about staying rent-free and joked about how he had time to figure things out, since I was covering everything. He interrupted me several times, correcting details, shaking his head dramatically. But then, one officer asked a simple question. How long had he been living here? He said 3 months. The officer asked if he had any mail addressed to him at this address. He hesitated, said he didn't keep paperwork. Then the officer asked if his name appeared anywhere on the lease agreement. I pulled it up on my phone and handed it over. The officer, who had been quiet, finally spoke. He asked if my boyfriend had another address listed anywhere, on his ID, for example. My boyfriend's confidence faltered. He said his ID hadn't been updated yet. The officer asked to see it anyway. When he checked, the address listed was from another city entirely. Not only that, but it showed he had been cited there recently for a noise complaint. Everything shifted in that moment. The questions changed tone. The officer asked him why he claimed he couldn't leave if he had another residence listed. He stumbled over his words, his story losing coherence. The officer turned to me and asked if I wanted him removed from the property. I nodded, barely able to speak. The realization on his face was something I'll never forget. It wasn't fear at first, it was disbelief. He genuinely thought this would work in his favor. He thought the uniform alone would force me into compliance. When the officer explained that he was not a tenant and had no legal claim to the apartment, his tone hardened. The officer told him he needed to gather his belongings and leave, immediately. He argued, of course. He said it wasn't fair, that he had nowhere to go, that I had promised he could stay. The officer reminded him that staying as a guest did not grant him rights, especially without contributing financially or appearing on the lease. I stood quietly as he packed his things, watching months of tension collapse into a few hastily stuffed bags. As he passed me on the way out, he whispered that I'd regret this. The door closed behind him, and for the first time in months, the apartment was silent. The officers stayed a few minutes longer, advising me to change the locks and document everything. When they finally left, I sank onto the couch and cried, not out of sadness, but relief. The days that followed were strange. I kept expecting to hear his footsteps or his voice from the other room. Instead, there was space. Physical space and mental space. I changed the locks the next morning. I blocked his number. I informed my landlord about what had happened, just in case. The landlord was sympathetic and reassured me that I had done nothing wrong. Friends told me I was lucky, that things could have gone much worse. They were right, but luck wasn't the word I'd use. Awareness was. I started reading about similar situations, about people who slowly take control by exploiting kindness and patience. The patterns were painfully familiar. A week later, I received a message from an unknown number. It was him accusing me of ruining his life, of embarrassing him in front of the police. I didn't respond. Instead, I saved the message and added it to my growing folder of documentation. I wasn't going to be unprepared again. At night, I replayed the moment when everything flipped. One small detail. One check. One officer paying attention. I realized how close I had been to being trapped in a narrative I didn't create. That realization was terrifying, but it was also empowering. I had trusted my instincts when it mattered most. Episode 4. Life slowly returned to normal, though my definition of normal had changed. I became more cautious, more aware of how easily boundaries can blur when emotions are involved. I replayed the early days of our relationship, noticing red flags I had dismissed as stress or insecurity. The way he tested limits. The way he framed generosity as obligation. About a month after he left, I ran into him unexpectedly at a grocery store. He looked different, angrier, more worn down. When he saw me, his expression tightened, but he didn't approach. I paid for my groceries and left without looking back. That moment felt like closure, even though no words were exchanged. I started sharing my story with close friends, and then with acquaintances who confided similar experiences. The responses were overwhelming. People told me about partners who refused to leave, who manipulated authorities, who used fear as leverage. I realized how common this tactic was, and how rarely it was talked about openly. One evening, while scrolling online, I saw a post that mirrored my experience almost exactly. Different names, same threats, same attempt to weaponize the system. I commented briefly, offering support. The original poster replied, thanking me and saying my words gave them the courage to stand firm. That was when I understood that telling this story mattered. I wasn't a victim in the way he tried to portray me, but I had been targeted. Kindness had been mistaken for weakness. I promised myself I would never confuse the two again. I learned that saying no didn't require justification, and that protecting myself wasn't cruelty. Months passed, and the memory softened. The fear faded. What remained was clarity. The apartment felt like mine again, not just legally, but emotionally. Every room was peaceful, untouched by tension. I slept better. I laughed more. I trusted myself. The irony of the situation stayed with me. He had called the police expecting sirens for me, expecting power to shift in his favor. Instead, that call became the moment everything unraveled for him. It was a reminder that manipulation depends on secrecy and assumption. The moment facts enter the room, it collapses. I began volunteering with a local group that helped people understand tenant rights and personal boundaries. I didn't give legal advice, but I shared experiences. Real ones. People listened. Some recognized themselves in my story. Others said they wished they had heard it sooner. The experience didn't make me bitter, but it did make me wiser. I learned to slow down when helping others, to set clear terms, to put agreements in writing even when it felt awkward, especially then. Every so often, I wondered if he learned anything from what happened. People who rely on control rarely reflect unless forced to. I doubted it. But whether he learned or not no longer mattered. I had. Time created distance, but the lesson stayed sharp. I dated again, cautiously at first, then more confidently. I communicated boundaries early, watching how people responded. Respect showed itself quickly when I paid attention. Sometimes I thought about how close I came to doubting myself when the police arrived. How easy it would have been to panic and comply. That scared me more than anything else. It reminded me how authority can be misused and how essential it is to stay grounded in truth. I kept the documentation folder even after it was no longer necessary, not out of fear, but as a reminder. Evidence is power. Preparation is protection. One afternoon, I received a message from a stranger online. They said they had read a comment I left months ago and wanted to thank me. They had been pressured by a partner in a similar way and remembered my words when things escalated. They stood their ground. They were safe now. I stared at the message for a long time. That was the moment everything truly flipped for me, not during the police visit, but here. My experience had become something larger than pain. It had become a warning and a guide. Looking back, I don't regret helping him at the beginning. Compassion isn't a mistake. Trusting someone isn't a flaw. The mistake would have been ignoring the truth once it revealed itself. I didn't. He tried to control the narrative. He tried to use fear as leverage. He tried to turn authority into a weapon. All it took was one detail being checked for everything to fall apart. And in that collapse, I found my strength.